Hello, I'm Reggie York. This is Module 2 of the Management Fundamentals series of modules. This one focuses on strengthening the Board of Directors for the Human Service Organization. At the completion of this module, you should be able to, first of all, discuss the roles and functions of the Board of Directors of the nonprofit organization. What role do they play? What functions do they serve? Who are they and how and why, and so forth. Number 2, identify how the board, the executive, and the staff should relate to one another. 3 critical sets of actors in the human service organizations. How should they relate to one another? Number 3, identify the types of persons who are normally on the board and the qualities of good board members. So those are 3 things we're going to be dealing with in this presentation. All nonprofits have a board who exercises power over the organization and has functions such as these 4 listed: hiring the executive, formulating the mission, policies, and so forth, representing the community, assuring accountability, and so forth. This is the fundamental legal body that represents the organization as far as the community is concerned. The board, in essence, relates to the community for the organization. I want to stop here a minute and have you read this particular statement from Holland. Hit the pause button, read it, and come back. As you can see here, the board is the basic legal entity, and it is the source of legitimacy for the organization. Let's reflect on a couple of things. Is the board more likely to have an active role in A, revising the mission when community conditions have changed, or more likely to have a role in dealing with the fact that 2 employees don't get along very well with each other? Well, I hope you said A, because that is more in line with what a board would be concerned with. The second one would be something the executive or the supervisors may need to deal with, but probably not the board of directors. Number 2, is the board more likely to have an active role in A, doing something about the fact that expenses are greater than revenue in the middle of the year, or making the intake protocol better? Well, I hope you said A, because again, A is more like what a board would be involved in working with. Here is another reflection. Is the board more likely to have an active role in A, doing something about the fact that I'm sorry, that's a repeat of the previous one. Okay, let's go to the next one. Who is normally on the board? Prominent persons in the community with an interest in the agency's mission, or professionals in this type of agency? Well, they're more likely to be the first one, prominent persons in the community. Usually you don't have much, if any, in the way of professionals in the field. You might have 1 or 2, but it's more typically prominent persons than it is professionals in the field. How about this one? Persons who demonstrate leadership and civic commitment, or persons with lots of money but no interest in our mission? Well, I hope you said the first part of that one. Persons who demonstrate leadership is more important than persons with lots of money, although it certainly doesn't hurt to have people who have lots of money. Number 3, persons who can bring a special expertise to the board, such as law, accounting, etc., or persons with no expertise in anything. Well, you may have both types, but you're more likely to have persons who have special expertise will be a little more valuable to the board than someone who has no expertise at all. Although boards should usually hire expertise from outside the board in regard to things like laws and accounting and so forth. Okay, board and executive. Let's talk about that a little bit. The board hires the executive, but usually depends heavily upon the executive for critical information and guidance. It's easy for a lot of executives to really dominate the board because they filter information to the board in a way that promotes their power and control over things. That's not the best way for the executive to function. The executive should help the board do its job best by giving them good information. Although the board has the authority to set policy, the normal practice is that the executive suggests a policy and guides the board in this regard. Ideally, the board would have people who know a lot about the policies and what ought to be a policy and so forth, but typically the nonprofit organization does not rely upon board members for this as much as they rely upon the executive, perhaps, and staff as well. A good executive will give the board the information they need to know in order to do their job. Not too much to get them overwhelmed with details that they don't understand. Give them the information they need in order to make the policy decisions that they need to make wisely. Let's talk a little bit about the authority of the board. The board members do not possess power as individuals. The board acts as a collective. For example, individual board members are not empowered to give orders to staff or the executive unless they've been given that power specifically by their board in a given situation. Boards normally have officers. This typically is the president, vice president, treasurer, secretary. Boards normally have committees like finance, personnel, program, etc., who report to the board. The executive committee, which usually consists of the officers of the board of the nonprofit, often is empowered to act on behalf of the board in certain situations. So the executive committee is the one with the most power. Let's talk a little bit about hiring. Who hires the executive? Who hires the staff? Who selects board members? Let's look at these individually. Who hires the executive? Well, it's typically the board of directors who hires the executive. Who hires the staff? It's typically the executive who hires the staff. Who selects board members? This may vary to some degree from one organization to the next, but typically the board of directors itself selects people to replace board members who go off. And usually board members' terms are limited to a certain number of years. So after a certain number of years, you may go off the board. So you have to be replaced. And it is the board itself that decides who that will be. Let's talk about the agency executive and the board. With regard to the review of data, should the executive give the board a summary? That should say a summary of need data. Sorry about that. A summary of need data or a lengthy report on need with lots and lots and lots of details, pages and pages and pages of details. Well, I hope you said A because board members usually don't have the time, maybe not the expertise to look through lots and lots of details and make sense of it. So a summary of that by the executive is really what's more useful for them. Should the executive give the board a great many details on service statistics or a few graphs that show the highlights? Well, I would say that it is B, a few graphs that show the highlights. Again, giving them information that they can understand and use in executing their duties. Here are some qualities of good board members. Interest in the agency mission, leadership, ability to communicate, willingness to represent the agency with the public, respect for role boundaries, especially with staff members. So look at each of those and see if you have any particular questions about them. These are the kinds of things you want in regard to board members. The final one there is sharing the values of the agency. The board and marketing. It is important that both your board and your staff know how to tell others what your agency accomplishes and how they accomplish it. They should be able to respond when someone asks them, what does your organization do? And how does it do it? What does it accomplish? And so forth. How about let's look at a couple of ideas. The first one is a public one, not a nonprofit one. But the question here is, which of these is us? Do our parole officers A, find evidence of parole violation so parolees are sent back to prison where they belong, or improve the odds that the parolee will make it in society? I would assume you have decided that B is the better one. And so, in terms of marketing, what is the image you want to portray? And how do you do it with your staff as well as board? What do we do? Do our mentors who work in our program, do they spend time with kids or reduce risk of delinquency through role modeling of good behaviors? Obviously, the second one is the better marketing message. Let's talk about how the board should relate to the staff. Should board members be personal friends with staff members? Um, and should, if so, how should um, uh, the executive deal with this? Uh, Hopefully, you don't have very much of this going on, but it's a touchy issue that is a challenge for the executive to deal with. Should the board have means of communication with staff that's not controlled by the agency executive? I would say yes. Sometimes, often they do not, but they should. What should be the role of the board in each of these? Rethinking the agency mission. Well, that certainly should be something they are required to do. Setting annual goals of the agency. Yes. Approving the agency budget. Yes. Hiring the executive. Yes. Firing the executive. Yes. If it's needing. Hiring staff. Usually not. That's usually the job of the executive. Determining which clients will be served. Usually not. That's usually the staff and the executive decision. This is the end of the presentation. I hope this was helpful to you in reflecting on the board of directors of the Human Service Organization.